Welcome back, students. In our next session, Thomas and I will discuss the drawbacks, some bad parts about Bitcoin. Let me start with recent news. I think recently the G20 had a meeting, and they tried to define Bitcoin as a commodity, not a currency. Because all these leaders or representatives consider that Bitcoin lacks some of the crucial parts of currency. So Thomas, why don't you start with your observations of the drawbacks of Bitcoin?
Well, first of all, it's understandable to me why the G8, G7, or G20 would be concerned about Bitcoin, because it's decentralizing the financial system. And the G8, for example, the G20 have been centrally controlled for the most part for a long, long time by a group of private individuals we call the elite, who own the central banks that we often call government banks, but mostly they're not government banks, they're privately owned banks. So for the elite, let's call them, Bitcoin represents a risk as well as an opportunity, depending on how they play it. As for Bitcoin being a commodity or a currency, the currencies we use these days are exactly the same as Bitcoin. Come on, let's face it. Have a look at the currency, the numbers on each bill, each dollar bill, each Taiwan bill. Regardless, these currencies we use these days, the paper currencies, are called fiat currencies or fiat money, because they're known to be simply funny money, fake money. Bank or the government, depending on who owns the printing presses, prints the money, and suddenly they say, okay, I'm going to pay you with these numbers that I just printed. And if you have a look at the serial numbers on the currencies of the Taiwan dollar, the US dollar, the pound, that's actually already a blockchain number. This is what most people are missing. So the blockchain used with currencies is nothing new. What is new is it's decentralized. The ownership is decentralized, effectively taking control from a small group of super rich individuals and spreading that control, hopefully, to a larger group of people. That being said, there are some grave dangers associated with Bitcoin.
As Thomas, you mentioned, because now we use blockchain to store all the transactions of Bitcoin. And also another problem that comes from this process is that those blockchains, they also record other information onto them.
Yeah.
So in some processes, well, they will record like the Bitcoin users, maybe they also visit some dark websites or install some improper information to the blockchain as well. So then with this, well, problematic information, some government will say, oh, then it's not good for Bitcoin to continue running in this way, because there are some criminal records stored on this blockchain as well.
Well, that's another fear, and the reason criminals and, let's call them, dark characters have been using Bitcoin to exchange, for example, on what is called the dark web, is because there's no name attached to the Bitcoin. However, one Bitcoin, for example, when it's mined, it comes up, it has a unique identifying number. So wherever that Bitcoin goes, or wherever those pieces of Bitcoin goes, we will always have what's called a real money trail to trace that exchange back to its origin. What we don't necessarily have is a real name to trace back and have accountability associated with that Bitcoin. So there are dangers there, but these are the same dangers kind of associated with money that we have now. The real problem with Bitcoin right now lies in the way that Bitcoin is created. Specifically, it has to be mined. And mining Bitcoin requires that computers solve complex mathematical problems called algorithms. And solving these problems takes a huge amount of computing power, which in essence translates to a huge amount of energy being used to create one Bitcoin. So what is that telling us? For example, if it takes, let's say, 6 barrels of oil in terms of energy consumption to create one Bitcoin, we're actually creating money with a negative value on it already. We're spending money to create money, so as soon as that Bitcoin is created, there's actually a negative value associated with this. But it gets worse. So many people have jumped on to the Bitcoin cryptocurrency mining wagon, let's call it, that it is now using altogether. All the miners throughout the world are now using the equivalent amount of energy of various countries. And it's growing and growing to such an extent that some people are warning that if we do not stop this, we are headed for total destruction of the environment, because we're going to double the amount of energy we need to live on. We're going to double that amount of energy we need in the course of 2 or 3 years. Thus, we're looking at a global catastrophe wherein we're destroying our environment ever more quickly, merely for the purpose of solving complex mathematical equations to get digital numbers called cryptocurrencies, which don't exist anywhere but in the virtual world. So it's like burning oil for the sake of making CO2.
I think Thomas has depicted a really vivid situation. Like, we probably all know that the major component of a diamond is carbon. Why don't we use energy to change carbon into a diamond? Because it's really energy consuming, so it's not worth it. So we should consider, is it worth it that we spend so much energy in creating more Bitcoins? That's something we hope you can think in the future. I guess that's the end of our last discussion section. So as usual, we have 2 questions for you. My first question would be, I mentioned at the meeting of G20, they don't think Bitcoin is a kind of currency. What's the word they have to describe Bitcoin?
Okay. My question would be, is why, when each Bitcoin is created or mined, why do I say that it has a negative value to it?
Thank you for being with us for another MOOC lesson. We hope to see you in the future.
Thanks.
See you.
Bye.